Hi, and welcome to Gartner Live. I'm Heather Pemberton Levy, and today we're going to hear about the 5 trends driving this year's Hype Cycle for Emerging Technologies 2020 from Brian Burke, Research Vice President. Hi, Brian.
Hi, Heather.
So, the hype cycle for emerging technologies is a perennial favorite. It's one of our most popular pieces of research because of the technology it plots. And I know there's a very interesting process of how you get to those final technologies. But first, because we publish hype cycles on all different types of technologies, can you tell us why this one's different?
Well, the hype cycle for emerging technologies is really unique at Gartner because this is the hype cycle where we're really looking across all of the 1,700 technologies that we track and distilling that down into a set of must-know technologies and trends that people we want to highlight for people as the most important, impactful trends that we see across industries. So that's really what makes it unique. Whereas we have other regional focused hype cycles or industry focused hype cycles or technology focused hype cycles in a specific technology area. This one goes across all of them.
Right. And so, if you're looking at that high volume of technologies, I can imagine it takes some negotiation to get to the final 30. How does that process work, Gartner?
Well, it is quite a process. We start in about May, and we start as the authors of individual hype cycle innovation profiles are authoring those profiles. We reach out to them and ask them to identify any that they feel should be on the short list. We also go through and we go through a criteria. So we're not looking for we can cut away the ones that are further along in terms of maturity. We cut away the ones that are lower in impact. And we end up with about 150 that we score. Now, we recruit people from the emerging technology research community, and we get about a dozen people, and we go through and we score them individually. And that gives us a list, an ordered list of what we believe are the most important technologies. Then we apply an algorithm that says really discounts those points for technologies that have been on the hype cycle before and increases points for technologies that are introduced new this year on the hype cycles. So really what we're doing is we're getting a look at what are not only the most impactful technologies, but what are the ones that are most fresh that we haven't exposed to our clients before. So that's really the idea behind this process that takes a couple of months really to put this together.
Right. And the emerging technologies always have some really cool ones in there, right? Didn't Smart Dust sit on it for a while? I remember writing about that a few years ago, and there was one about bones being able to, open doors and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so this changed. This is a change from 2 years ago. For the last 2 years, we have been purposefully moving those perennial favorites off to make more room for other technologies. Obviously, we have limited real estate with about 30 that we can highlight. And we did have some perennial favorites, like Smart Dust was on the hype cycle for six years. Quantum computing was on the hype cycle for 13 years. So it turned into a teenager on the hype cycle. And we didn't think that that's tremendously useful for our clients. So that's why we've shifted to where it's more fresher look for the hype cycle.
Right. Okay, so we're going to talk about trends in a minute. I want to let our viewers know that they can ask Brian questions on this form by posting it into the comment section. So we'll get to those in a little bit. So just ask your questions and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Okay, so now you look at these 30 technologies and you group them into bigger trends, which is part of the research in and of itself, right? Putting out there what are the trends that we're seeing from the emerging technologies. Can you tell us how you come up with the trends?
Actually, that's probably the hardest part of the whole effort. Because really what we're looking at is we end up with, as I say, a rank ordered list, and we pick off the top 30. But then we say, well, what's really going on here? What glue is holding these things together? What is the underlying trend that we're seeing? And that's how we come up with the 5 trends for the technologies.
That's great. Well, we're going to talk about those trends and some of those 30 technologies in just a minute. But first, I want to remind you all that Gartner Virtual IT Symposium Expo 2020 is coming up, and you can get more information on the web. So check out the agenda. Brian will be there talking about the hype cycle and the technologies, along with many of our other experts. So useful to check out if you want more information. Okay, let's start and get into the first trend. This is the one that I think I need the most explanation about: composite architectures. Can you describe for us what that is and a couple technologies in that trend?
Okay, so a composite architecture is really, think of it as an architecture of technologies that are, put together like Lego building blocks. And so the advantage of that, and we've got kind of snap together solutions that we're talking about. The advantage of that is that we can, rapidly reconfigure those applications when business conditions change. Now, for organizations that had, a highly modular environment with COVID-19, as we needed to change a lot of things, the way that we were doing business, they were able to rapidly reconfigure. And that's really what this composite architecture is all about. So, as you mentioned, there's some interesting technologies in there. We call kind of the umbrella term we use is the composite enterprise. The composite enterprise is really made up of packaged business capabilities. Now, packaged business capability you can think of as a chunk of functionality, right? That we can snap together. So it's snapped together with APIs, and it's built on a flexible data fabric, which is another trend in this category. A data fabric is really looking at how do we get access to the data from many different sources by applying artificial intelligence to metadata about the data that's out there, to be able to get seamless access to data regardless where it is. And so, those are a couple of the trends in composite architectures, which is the composable enterprise, data fabric, and packaged business capabilities.
Did this trend become more imperative given where we are now in business with everything that's happened and how organizations have had to adapt and move so quickly?
Absolutely. So, with the COVID-19 pandemic, which basically upended everything, organizations, were suddenly exposed to the incredible level of debt that they had, technical debt and process debt. And when we talk about those things, what we're talking about is that decisions that were made in the past to optimize around delivery over elegant code, or to put in place workarounds for processes rather than to automate those processes. Those decisions kind of come back to haunt us, because now when we go to change, as we had to with the pandemic, now that we go to change, we've got it's extraordinarily difficult to change those things. So it's absolutely heightened by the pandemic. Absolutely, it's been an ongoing problem for many, many years, but the pandemic and the urgency around change in the pandemic has clearly made it worse.
Right, right. Yeah, so it makes a lot of sense in that context. The second one is also really relevant today: algorithmic trust. Can you share with us what you mean by that?
Yeah, algorithmic trust is a shift in our trust models. So by default, our standard trust model is basically a centralized trusted authority. So you have that with government, in regulators a lot. You have that in banks or clearinghouses. So you have this trusted centralized source for the exchange of whatever. Algorithmic trust replaces that with algorithms, and so blockchain and blockchain related technologies, as distributed ledgers, they have algorithmic trust built in. But this trend isn't only about blockchain. In fact, blockchain isn't one of the technologies listed in the trend. It's really about how you can apply algorithms more generally to implement those trust models. So we do have things that are based on blockchain, like authenticated provenance. So what we're talking about in authenticated provenance is really where an asset comes from. So that could be a physical asset, or it could be a digital asset. And it's becoming more important, as we're increasingly aware with the elections coming up, to understand where information is coming from. So with fake news and all of that, if we can verify what is the source of an article, for example, that is useful. Or if we can verify where's the source of physical goods like diamonds, for example. Diamonds, we want to make sure that they're not conflict diamonds, or pharmaceuticals. 30% of the pharmaceuticals sold in Africa are counterfeit. So authenticated provenance, it's built on, there's various methods, but one method is using blockchain technologies to determine where something comes from. Another interesting trend in there that doesn't use blockchain is differential privacy. With differential privacy, what we're doing is we are encrypting data, and then we can share it with third parties as encrypted data, and they can perform operations and analysis on that data without decrypting it. So if we have sensitive data, confidential data, personally identifiable information, let's say we're a hospital, we want to participate in a study, we want to share information with a broader group of hospitals and researchers, well, we can encrypt that using differential privacy, and then have that information, even though obviously it contains personally identifiable information, we can share that information so that we can look at the aggregate results without looking at the individual details. So that's really some of the things in algorithmic trust.
So it gives us more control over our privacy, the individual. And
Yeah,
for businesses, for the first couple examples you gave, it gives them a scalable way to ensure the viability of products. That's very
that's
interesting.
yeah, exactly right.
Okay, let's discuss the third trend in the Gartner Hype Cycle for Emerging Technologies 2020. And if you're just joining us, you can post questions in the comments section. We will get to them in a short while. The third trend is beyond silicon.
Beyond silicon contains a couple of technologies. That's really a trend where we're talking about, what are, as we reach the physical limits of silicon, what are the technologies that are being explored and materials that are being explored to replace silicon. So we have, technologies in there like carbon-based transistors, and a carbon-based transistor reduces the energy requirements. So as opposed to a silicon-based transistor, a carbon-based transistor has 10x reduction in energy requirements, and is potentially much faster than silicon as well. We also have in that trend DNA compute and storage. So DNA compute is probably further out, but DNA storage is starting to be experimented with now, and that's where we're using DNA to store information. The advantage of that is that we can store information in greater density. But the way that we do it is kind of interesting as well, because what happens is DNA is made up of 4 nucleobases. So we can change bits, binary, zeros and ones, and assign a code to each of those nucleobases. And then we can generate strings of DNA with the appropriate nucleobases as a synthetic DNA string, and that will serve as storage. And so then, we go through the reverse process to turn it back into digital. But that's some of the work that's being done in this beyond silicon trend.
And you can see that with all of the data that we're collecting or we're creating across so many different formats, that something like that could really take off.
We're creating an
Interesting.
enormous amount of data. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, our fourth trend sounds interesting. Formative artificial intelligence. Can you share with us more on that?
Yeah, it is interesting. There's a lot of technologies in there. There's, I think, 9 different technologies in formative AI. And formative AI, we came up with that name because really, as we look across these technologies, what are we seeing that's different? And what we're seeing is a lot more adaptability and creativity in these technologies. And so when I say creativity, means that computers can now be creative, which is rather shocking. If you're a guy like me who was, in college 35 years ago and learned that, computer couldn't even generate a real random number. So now having them be creative is kind of interesting. But excuse me, a couple of the technologies in there are things like adaptive machine learning. So with adaptive machine learning, that's a machine learning model that can be updated in production. So typically with machine learning models, we have a machine learning model, we have an algorithm that we leverage with a lot of data to train a model. We test that model, and then we put a static model into production. That's typically how it's done. With adaptive machine learning, we're really taking that and then continuing to change that in production so that where you have dynamically changing environments, then you can have an adaptive learning machine learning model to do that. As I mentioned, the other technology, well, there's a couple of technologies here, but one is generative AI. With generative AI, that is where we are creating entirely new things. Now, generative AI, it's kind of got a bad name, got off to a bad start, because generative AI and some of the technologies within that sort of umbrella term, like generative adversarial networks, variational autoencoders, reinforcement learning, those technologies are also the technologies that are used to produce deep fakes. So pictures of people that don't exist,
Mhm.
videos of Obama saying things that Obama would never say, and so that's kind of where the technology got started, but it has much more potential than that. So it's also good for doing things like generating synthetic data. So if we don't have enough training data to train an AI model, we can generate synthetic data. Or if we want to ensure privacy around data, we can generate synthetic data that represents the real data but isn't real data. And we also use for things, at the edge of where that technology is going, is used for things like material science, using, an inverse design process to identify what material would have the properties that you're looking for. So that's searching all of the latent space in an optimized search to identify a new material. Or the same thing with drug discovery, to identify what drugs or what would be the appropriate structure for a particular drug. So those are some of the interesting things that are going on in generative AI.
Synthetic data, synthetic storage. It sounds like we're getting really creative with how we can support
We
our
are, aren't we?
needs for continued data consumption and protecting the privacy. I really like how all of this is stitching together, at least for me. Okay, let's tackle the fifth trend, and then we're going to get to some questions. We have a few coming in, so if you have any, post them in the comment section. The fifth, the final trend on this year's Emerging Technologies Hype Cycle is Digital Me. Can you share with us more on that one?
Absolutely. So digital me is really talking about a digital representation of ourselves. And we have things like digital twins of a person. We've had digital twins for a long time. Digital twin is a
Mm-hmm.
digital representation of a physical object, but that's mostly been used with machinery. Now we have digital twins of a person, which is a digital representation of a person. It's easy to understand that from a medical point of view. So we have health sensors. So we're monitoring glucose, for example, for diabetics or those kinds of things. And that's really, what that digital twin notion is. There's a couple of interesting technologies there that were spawned by the pandemic, health passports and social distancing technologies. So, excuse me, health passport is really where we have an application, an app on our mobile phone that has a QR code. And with that QR code, you get to enter public transport or public buildings or office buildings or supermarkets or whatever it happens to be. These are deployed in China and increasingly in India, where you have to show a green QR code to get in to various places. Now, the app is not that technically sophisticated, but the technology behind that is, in terms of the algorithms and tracking that's done behind the scenes to understand when you've been in a potentially exposed to the COVID virus, and that is what turns your code either yellow, or if you've tested positive, it turns it red. So health passports, interesting because they are a different approach to managing the pandemic, but also interesting because off the bat, these are less than 6 months old and they have 20% market penetration, simply because the two biggest countries in the world are moving forward with this, and it's very difficult to move around without them.
Mm-hmm.
The other one, social distancing technologies. You've probably heard of contact tracing apps. So tracing apps are what public health organizations are using to trace contacts, but also for industries within their organization. They want to trace employees. So, if we have hundreds or thousands of people working at an oil refinery, somebody's going to get sick. And when they do, we need to be able to find out who that person has been in contact with to avoid shutting down the entire facility. So, some interesting things there.
Right. And the digital me is always a little tricky. My reaction is often really cool, a little scary, because the more we're digitally represented, the more I think we tend to fear that our privacy will be invaded. We don't want to be tracked too much. And yet, when it comes to COVID-19, that kind of data could be so essential in saving lives and helping countries or communities get their arms around, who has it.
It's been a huge question
So,
with COVID-19. Sorry, I was just going to say it's a huge question about
no, go ahead.
balancing privacy and health with COVID-19. Yeah.
Right. And that's actually our first question. Anna from Columbia asks, how significantly has COVID-19 impacted the technologies included this year?
It has impacted the technologies. As we mentioned around composite architectures, that has become much more urgent for organizations, as well as these technologies that we talked about. So, health passport and social distancing technologies, they again have become much more, highlight in the spotlight these days. So, the technologies that really were affected because of COVID-19. There's another one here in algorithmic trust that we call SASE. That's Secure Asset Service Edge. That's another technology that is affected by the pandemic. What that is access and security for remote access to digital assets, so systems and so on, which obviously became a huge issue for lots of organizations as we had a lot of people remote working. And a lot of organizations
Mm,
just didn't have the capability or didn't have the technology to be able to do that. And other organizations needed to improve those capabilities. And so they're implementing the Secure Access Service Edge or SASE for that as well. So it did have an impact clearly on some of these technologies and the priority of them.
right. That makes sense. Nico from Bengaluru asks, how can these emerging technologies help in exponential job creation?
Exponential job creation. That's an interesting question, Nika. Let me think about that for a minute. Um, yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that probably when we look at formative AI and we look at AI in general, people look at AI as a job replacement technology. Actually, we don't look at it that way. We look at it as a job augmentation technology. And so all of these technologies that we're talking about in formative AI, they're going to be able to augment people to do things that we haven't been able to do before. So, if we were looking for exponential employment opportunities and the technologies that enable them, I would say, perhaps counterintuitively, that AI is going to drive that because AI is generally used for augmenting human activities.
Right. That makes sense. David from England asks, how is government regulation going to impact the encrypted data trends?
Ah, well, it's that's interesting. Yes, David. There is where we're talking about differential privacy. Yes, we are talking about encrypted data, but this is data that's typically going to be owned by an organization, shared out in a selective way to semi-trusted partners. So that doesn't really, the government's not necessarily involved in that. With regulation and government, that's most often involved in communication data. So in instant messaging and chat and things like that. So there are a lot of efforts in government and debates about how those technologies should be regulated. But I don't think that we have any really magic ball into where that ongoing debate is going to end. I think that we're going to continue to have this sort of back and forth between government and business and bad guys on the encryption of data. Should we put in a backdoor? And once we put in a backdoor, that opens it up to everybody because somebody will break it, not just the government. And so it's going to be an ongoing debate, I think, for years.
Right, right. That makes sense. We have two more questions here. Shannon from Canada asks, what role do you expect generative AI to play in the fight against COVID-19?
There is work that's going on right now with COVID-19 to try to identify. Now I'm getting in over my head in terms of pharmaceuticals, but there is work going on. I know right now with generative AI to try to identify what are the potential chemicals or drugs that would potentially have an impact on COVID-19. So there's a number of vendors working on this. I spoke to one earlier in the week. And they're really trying to identify drugs for treatment, so existing drugs for treatment that could have an impact or positive effect for COVID people who have COVID-19. So there is work going on around that. But as I say, I'm a little bit out of my depth in terms of the pharmacology in how that exactly works.
That's fine. We won't ask you to go there. Okay, our final question, okay. And this bridges to something I was actually going to end with too, which is Mark from New York asks, how can CIOs assess which of these technologies make sense for their businesses? And I did want to make sure we had an opportunity to discuss how the hype cycle, why it's so important for business leaders to be tracking these technologies, some that seem a little far out, but important for them to have them on their radar screens.
It is important to track these technologies to understand. So to understand what is going to be the impact for their industry and their organization. And so the way that you do that is that you look at the technology and you look at the technology capability. And so, what is it capable of doing? And capability, invariably improves over time. But capability is also usually, for most technologies, in a number of use cases. So what are the potential use cases for this technology? What is the level of maturity for that technology in that particular use case? And then what you try to do is to identify what are the use cases where we could leverage that in terms of, adding a business capability for our organization by leveraging an emerging technology. And so it's matching use cases to business capabilities that identifies opportunities for these business opportunities. And then you track business opportunities as the technology matures to where the point where it is viable for deployment in that particular business scenario. So you want to go through that path. It's basically technology, capability, use case, match to business scenario, track in terms of technology maturity, maturation, on a timeline until that technology is mature enough to launch in that use case.
That's great. So thank you, Brian. We really appreciate taking the time to go through this. Thank you. And for all of you who would like more information on this year's Gartner Hype Cycle for Emerging Technologies 2020. You can view the full hype cycle and read more about it on Smarter with Gartner. You can also register for Brian's upcoming webinar on September 30th. And finally, you can get more information from Brian and a number of other experts in the virtual Gartner IT Symposium Expo taking place this fall. Just visit our website for more information. We look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks for joining us.